Hello and welcome to another Talking Shop with Covering Climate Now. I'm Mark Hertsgaard, and I'm the environmental correspondent at The Nation magazine and also the co-founder and executive director of Covering Climate Now. Our subject today, the climate story after Glasgow. So Covering Climate Now, for those of you who don't know, is a global collaboration of more than 400 news outlets around the world, reaching a combined audience of roughly 2 billion people. We're organized by journalists for journalists. We help newsrooms everywhere do a better job of covering what we call the defining story of our time. It costs nothing to join Covering Climate Now. There's no editorial line except respect for science. You can visit our website, coveringclimatenow.org, and you'll see a list of our partners. And you can also sign up there for our weekly newsletter, check out our resources, join our Slack channel, and apply for you or your news outlet to join Covering Climate Now. In these talking shops, we gather as colleagues to talk through a given aspect of covering the climate story, just like we would around the water cooler or going out for drinks after work. And today, we're discussing what climate coverage after COP26 should look like, and especially how all of us can engage our audiences with that coverage. Certainly one key element of the Glasgow Climate Pact the government signed at COP26 is that those governments have to come back again next year and try harder, do better. They're supposed to bring updated climate action plans to COP27 in Egypt. Those plans are supposed to get closer to limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, as science says is necessary to avoid catastrophic and perhaps irreversible climate disruptions. The world, of course, remains far from that goal, but all is not lost. I want to bring everyone's attention to an article that Scientific American published in collaboration with Covering Climate Now at the start of COP26. That article overturned what many non-scientists, including we journalists, have long thought about how the climate system works. For decades, we've been told that even if all emissions ended overnight, temperatures would nevertheless keep rising for about 30 years because of the physical inertia of the climate system, especially the long lifespan of CO2 in the atmosphere. That turns out to be wrong. In fact, if we halt all emissions, the real lag time is not 30 years, but closer to 3 years. In short, rapid and steep emissions cuts can still make a big difference toward keeping the 1.5 goal alive. And so that's where journalists come in. Of course, that kind of rapid action will only happen if governments and other big interests dramatically accelerate their climate actions. So one question for us, in addition to how we engage audiences, is how do we hold governments and corporations and banks and other powerful interests, how do we hold them to account for making, not just talking about, but actually making the policy shifts needed, both to limit temperature rise and to address the climate adaptation and loss and damage issues that were such a contentious part of COP26. So today, in the first half hour, we will hear from 3 superb panelists, each of whom covered COP26 on the ground in Glasgow, as I did. And then in the second hour, of course, your questions and answers. We're going to do it a little differently this time from previous talking shops. Add your questions into the chat box with your name and news outlet. And then during the Q&A, I'll call on you and you will be able to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to the panelists. Everyone is also welcome to tweet throughout this session. Please use the @CoveringClimateNow tag and the hashtag CCNow, all in caps. And at the end of the hour, you're invited to complete a very short survey, literally less than 2 minutes, just telling us about subjects for future talking shops. Now, will you please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to our panelists. Alex Thomson. Alex is the chief correspondent at Channel 4 News in the United Kingdom. I'm sure you will all remember that delicious sting video last June, where the ExxonMobil lobbyist spilled the company's secrets about undermining climate action in Washington. That was Alex and his team at Channel 4 in action. Also joining Alex Thomson, Stephanie Ebbs. Stephanie is a reporter and producer for the ABC News Climate Unit based in Washington, D.C. She's reported on climate issues and policy for all of the ABC News platforms, and she's co-produced special programs on climate issues for both ABC and Hulu. And also Disha Shetty. Disha is an independent journalist, science journalist based in Pune, India. She writes mainly on public health, environment, and gender, and of course, the impact of climate change on communities throughout India. Covering Climate Now is very proud to have all three of these superb journalists with us today, and I want to thank each of them for making the time to be here. So now to the questions. I'm going to start with you, Alex. You said in your bio for this session that after 30 years of covering armed conflicts around the world, that you consider climate change the biggest war you've ever covered, quote, with only very limited peace talks visible, unquote. And I must say, covering COP26 at times felt a little bit like covering a war, not in the sense of personal danger for journalists, but rather the blur of all these different actions and trying to make sense of them. You said that some of the key developments at COP26 actually concerned money, specifically whether trillions of dollars that are floating around the world economy, are they going to be invested in climate-friendly ways or climate-destructive ways? Could you talk a little bit about that money side of COP26 and especially how journalists can engage their audiences on that going forward?
Yeah, sure, Mark. And first of all, thanks for having me and thanks for the work that you're doing. It's this is one of these initiatives which, if it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. So I'm grateful that you spent your time and energy to do that. Yeah, I mean, like all, there are two COPs. First of all, there's the communique and the burning the midnight oil. And this year we had tears from Alok Sharma. Who knew? So you have that drama, and that's the political, and that's the UN, this grinding machine. And then there's always the other COP going along, which is CEOs and banking organizations and hedge funds and all the rest of it making the pledges of money. And don't forget, a lot of those people are these days way ahead of many of our governments. They're way ahead in many senses of certainly the government in the UK, possibly the US, and obviously they're way ahead of governments like Brazil and Australia, the recidivist nations in this. So yeah, I think that was the promises that were made in the first week. If they happen, will be the biggest realignment of industrial capital globally since James Watt invented the steam engine. And journalism as a whole across the world has not yet cottoned on to this. We're still seeing climate vaguely in terms of a sort of a paradigm of left-wing, right-wing, left-wing sustainables, right-wing fossil fuels. That's a paradigm which never fitted, doesn't fit very well now. It's 25 to 50 years out of date, and is not serving the public. And just in question of a war, yeah, 30 years of war. This is a war. 3/4 of the emissions are caused by 100 companies. They are the enemy. They need to be outed. They need to be nailed 24/7.
So let's talk a little bit about the companies versus the finance capital. You're talking about how all of this, the money is beginning to shift. And I've made the same argument that a lot of the smart money has already left fossil fuels and is moving in a new direction. But this is one of the reasons that COPs are important. You know, the Paris COP with the 1.5-degree target, I think that was responsible for a lot of that shift in the money. How do we going forward, though, chart this, both the role of those, as you say, the 100 companies that are really the culprits here, but I guess the tension really between that sort of industrial capital and the financial capital, the money flows that seem to want, in some cases, to genuinely move away from the fossil fuel economy.
And in some ways they do, but not because they're nice people, because that's where the bottom line lies. You know, that's how capitalism works. We tell the story because it's a great dramatic story. It's a human interest story as well, in terms of jobs, in terms of livelihoods. It's a massive political story. It's a massive drama. Let me give you two examples either side of COP. There was a man with a funny hairdo called Donald Trump, got himself elected in a place called the United States some time ago, went to West Virginia to the coal belt, said, "Hi guys, we're going to make coal great again." Okay. The coal industry told him, "Sorry, Mr. President, we can't do that. We can't get the coal out of the ground as cheaply as the electricity can be produced these days by wind turbine generators." It never happened. Coal was never made great again. It never had, no matter how much the Don, and no doubt some of the people in West Virginia wanted it to be so. It wasn't so. Fast forward, just after COP, just last week, we have a new oil field, big embarrassment for the British government, potentially opening up in the Atlantic, west of the Shetland Islands, off the north coast of Scotland. 30% stake by Shell, a company that needs no introduction from me in this context. Shell pulled out because they say the money does no longer make sense in terms of the kind of oil that we're going to need 20 years hence, 30 years hence. That's how these people operate. They can't make it. That should tell us something about the way the world is shifting. Okay, the timing of it could be convenient just after COP, but I doubt it. There's a massive shift going on. It's a superb story, and it engages everybody and everything.
So one last question before I shift to Disha. So again, what advice would you give to other journalists, including those who are relatively new to the climate story, for how to chart that business side of the story and how they tie that to government action, and especially making audiences feel engaged with these subjects and understanding that it really does affect not just their daily life, but the future of their kids?
Number one, there are a huge raft of incredibly exciting technological stories that are going on. Okay, we went down to a place near London a few months ago to film a new type of lorry being powered by hydrogen. The guys doing that said, we think we're about 5 years off powering lorries by fresh air, right? Okay, that's the kind of stuff. So look at how the technology's changed, how the landscape's changed. You've got wind turbines everywhere. Look at how things are changing and changing with such rapidity. You know, this is the equivalent to the information revolution, the Microsoft, the Apple era of the 1990s and the noughties. It's happening all over again across energy, you know, which is the most boring thing in the world until now. So that's the story, you know, and at the same time, you know, it affects all of us because, yeah, we're all making changes. We can all make changes in our lives. We can reduce our plastic and we can all do stuff. But it comes down again to those 100 companies, you know, who incidentally want you to believe that we're all in this together. You know, that's the big lie they're peddling at the moment. Oh, we're all a part of this. Oh, we're all. No, we're not. Bullshit. We're not all responsible for this. Those major companies, fossil fuel companies, are responsible for this. They did it, you know, and those are the people who've got to be dragged kicking and screaming and changing, you know, and they will because the capital's moving. No hedge fund is investing in coal. Any hedge fund that's got their head screwed on, and most of them do in terms of money, because of stranded capital. The most terrifying phrase in the industrial capital world at the moment, stranded capital. It's happening in coal. It's going to start happening in oil and gas.
That's Alex Thomson with Channel 4 News. Thank you, Alex. We're going to shift now to Disha. And Disha, you specialize in health coverage. We've talked a little bit about this. And as you know better than any of us, India has some of the most polluted air in the world, thanks partly, not only, but partly to burning lots of coal. Disha, can you talk to us about how individual people's health concerns for themselves, for their children, et cetera, are a way to engage audiences with the climate story? And how do you yourself in your coverage, how do you try and play that role?
Right. So firstly, thank you so much for having me on this webinar. I started writing about climate change after I was covering health for a while. So by the time I started writing about how climate change was impacting communities across India, for me, the health impacts just stood out. So for instance, if because of water scarcity in a particular community, women were having to walk longer, it was having fallouts on their bodies. They'd have joint aches. They would drink less water to conserve water, and that would have other health complications for them. If floods were becoming more frequent, then it would have impact on their maternal health. It would have impact on sanitation, and vaginal infections, maternal mortality rates, and a lot of those kinds of fallouts. Some of the most common things that I saw in India in areas where sea level was rising, the salt water would come inside in coastal areas, and it would mix with the groundwater, because a lot of these communities were drinking water from extracting groundwater and using it to drink. And that mixing would result in the groundwater getting more salty, and then that would have impact on pushing up rates of hypertension in the community. And in Bangladesh, it's documented to have pushed up rates of miscarriages in pregnant women, and also birth complications. So as a journalist and as a health journalist primarily, I was able to be to see these impacts that were actually just you can't escape it. It's in your face. It just wasn't being documented in the same way. Air pollution, of course, India has one of the world's most polluted air. The entire Indo-Gangetic Plain, and of course, even Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal now has extremely bad toxic air, and everybody is concerned about their children. So that way, you can make it, and it's there's this general sense that people don't care about climate change. This is one way to make it relatable to them, because every parent is concerned about what kind of air my baby is breathing in. There are actually people moving out of Delhi because, and if they can afford to, because the air is too bad for their kids. They care obviously about elderly. Now we know that indoor air pollution, which is a substantial portion of pollution in India, affects women disproportionately more, because they're primarily doing all the cooking. And switching to cleaner cooking fuel will have huge gains for women's health. And people care about these stories, except that a lot of these stories weren't necessarily told through that lens for a long time, but now they are being told. And you see a lot of people responding to that, a lot of people engaging. I think the problem so far was just that people didn't see these connections. And as journalists, if you can help make those connections, it instantly people certainly care a lot about their children and the elderly in their family. So yes.
And Disha, have you sensed that? I mean, in your reactions, are you getting emails from readers? And also, very important, how do your editors see this as a plus in terms of, we're going to talk about health to get people interested in the climate story? Is that understood by your colleagues in the newsroom?
Yes, yes. Now, in the past, I'd say 2 to 3 years, there's a tremendous, and I think advocacy has played a huge role, because you also have a lot of NGOs, and I think the young kids have really made climate story and a headline, and so editors certainly are very sensitive to these stories. In fact, they commission more of these stories. So I think within the newsroom, there's certainly appetite for it, and there's interest to publish these stories. And on the journalism side also, the expertise is increasing as well. And what I haven't seen yet is, I haven't seen a lot of people. Because India is a democracy, I haven't seen it become an election issue as yet. I haven't seen people saying, give us clean air, and that needs to be an election issue. And I think that would be the next step, but that hasn't happened yet. But people are certainly interested. Mostly, I find a lot of people asking me, what can we do? Because I think for a long time, it's being made to look like individuals can change these systems, and they can't. And I find it hard to tell them that it's not really on you to do all of this. And in the only way they can push for change is through electoral politics. And somehow, I think as journalists, that's something that we can push for.
So again, we're picking up on the same theme from Alex Thomson, that it's not about individual action, as important as that can be, but rather governments and corporations and the big powers. Disha, before I turn to Stephanie Ebbs at ABC News, one more question for you. Of course, one of the most really controversial moments in COP26 came at the very end, when India, backed by China, demanded that the final agreement call not for a phase out of coal, but only a phase down. As you know, India got lots of criticism for that, both on the substance of the position and also on the process, the fact that it unveiled its demand at literally the last minute of these negotiations. Can you explain the Indian government position? I know that you're not the Indian government and you're not responsible for them, but can you explain that position? Because I think that the rest of the world didn't really hear India's position on why they had that point of view. And could you also give us a little information about what journalists should bear in mind as we cover not just India, but international climate action going forward, and these issues, the very vexing issues, especially of loss and damage?
So I will start with this. On the public health side, we now know that India's population has stabilized, and we've reached replacement level, and our population is no longer set to grow as much as we thought it would. But we still have about 1.3 billion people, and that's a huge population whose energy needs are to be met. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about what kind of people am I talking about. I'm talking about a largely agrarian population, which might not have running water at home. They might not, in some cases, even have electricity. They might be living in mud homes. You are asking that population to do more. And I think that's a nuance a lot of journalists in the West miss, that a typical Indian individual in living in rural area, which a large population of our country does live that way, isn't running through multiple cups, disposable cups of coffee in a day, and isn't really keeping their lights on 24/7. That's not the lifestyle that we're talking about, and that's not the population we're asking to step up to do more. In fact, we're asking developing countries with very little to do even more. So I think the Indian government, which knows our population and understands the needs of our country, was trying to defend our future energy needs. At the same time, I've been covering a lot of movement towards renewable energy, and India's been making huge strides in solar energy, in small hydropower. And that's something that India doesn't get enough credit for. And in terms of what happened before COP, was there was obviously a lot of promises about climate finance and acknowledgement that there will be some acknowledgement of loss and damage. As COP progressed, none of that was delivered, and in the end, it was all about, can India and China do more? And I think that while this was my first COP, this was my second UN event, because I've covered the General Assembly as a UN fellow in 2019. And I understand that even though the UN system tries to be egalitarian, it is not. There is a lot of bullying that happens. There's a lot of politics that happens. And while rich countries refuse to deliver on any of their dues when it came to climate finance and loss and damage, and asking developing countries to do more, it would merit actually criticism of, it should merit criticism of their stand, but it did not, because I think a lot of journalists in the global north really don't understand what the global south looks like. And that's something that I hope will change in the years forward.
Thank you. That's Disha Shetty. She is an independent science journalist from India. I'll just note one other point there. As I understand it, part of the concern on the part of both India and China was that, why is this agreement singling out coal among the fossil fuels when, as Alex Thomson has said, in Europe and the United States, basically coal is a declining industry. And so to ask the US to get rid of coal is not such a big ask, whereas both India and China still depend a lot on coal. And of course, you'll note that the final agreement did not mention oil, did not mention gas at all. So these are things to broaden all of our perspective on these questions. I'm now going to turn to Stephanie Ebbs, and I do so with special pleasure. I hope you don't mind me saying Stephanie, because I'm so proud that largely through Stephanie's actions and others inside of ABC News, including Ginger Z, ABC News joined Covering Climate Now, our collaboration, just a few days before COP26. So Stephanie, returning to the theme this morning, or today I should say, of this talking shop, of how do we engage audiences in climate coverage? Can you talk about how ABC approached and approaches that? Because ABC has a very, very large audience, but it's quite a general audience. And I'd be very curious to hear how you guys look at that challenge of how to engage an audience that is not necessarily going to be following every in and out of a UN session at COP26 or anywhere, and how to get them to engage with your climate coverage. Stephanie, you are still muted. Well, let's have a take
sorry. Take two. Thanks, Mark. I can speak to some of my personal takeaways in as a climate producer at ABC, and what I've sort of noticed about our coverage is that there's a couple of different things. One of them is that there's kind of capital C climate stories, and then there's stories like Disha is talking about, where you can pitch it as a public health story. There's a very strong climate connection, but maybe, it doesn't have to have big climate change in the headline. And that's a way to to get into these stories for an audience that maybe might feel overwhelmed or alienated by the connection to climate change as being something very scientific. I think, you know, weather is the biggest example of that. Everyone understands a weather event. And then if you can just make that climate connection for folks, it helps them out. You know, a couple of other things that I've learned from my experience is, you know, obviously for television, visuals are incredibly important, right? So around the COP, we did a lot of stories where we traveled to these incredible parts of the world, like my colleague who went to Greenland and was able to actually bring that to an American audience and kind of help make the point that these issues are all connected, but having those visuals is incredibly helpful. And then I think for me, the biggest challenge in all of this is finding the balance between, you know, everybody loves a solution story, right? Everybody loves these new technologies, all of these great things, and those are really fun stories to tell. But, you know, if there's one of the many takeaways from COP is that solution stories alone are not really the full picture of what we're seeing, right? So I try to approach this from any solution story we tell, we have to try to convey the stakes, like why is it important that this solution exists? What need is it addressing? But also remember that, especially for a US audience, you know, there is a bigger picture to climate change out there. And so we have, you know, my goal is always to balance what might be a great solution story with, you know, here's actually where we stand and what the future looks like according to the science.
You know, you're reminding me, Stephanie, that we've talked at previous talking shops about solutions journalism in particular. And it's a tricky thing especially for some more traditional journalists, say, oh, solutions, we shouldn't be doing that. It makes us sound like activists or, you know, biased or what have you. And I commend to all of you, check out the Solutions Journalism Network and how they look at this. And they make a very compelling argument, I think, that in fact, especially on climate change, if you're not talking about solutions, you're not telling the whole story. And solutions coverage does not, and indeed should not, be cheerleading. That's not our role. We should be just as tough about scrutinizing solutions as we are about scrutinizing politicians and CEOs. But if you're not talking about solutions, you're also not covering the whole story. And indeed, some of the audience research shows that people really want to hear what can be done about these problems. So one of my follow-ups to you, Stephanie, is does ABC, do you and your colleagues at ABC have any sense yet of how this new push towards climate change, you know, you guys did that whole slew of coverage going into COP26. You had your anchorman, David Muir, go to Madagascar, I believe, a lot of, you know, pretty high visibility coverage. Do you have any sense yet of how that is playing with your audience?
You know, I don't. I'm not necessarily privy to that information. You know, I can say that personally, you know, obviously you want to give audiences stories that they're interested in and compelling, but it's that, you know, bran and a donut conversation, right? You always want to have some meat to it. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to think about, especially now, is, okay, there's great solution stories. There's a lot of perhaps lighthearted stories you can tell about the environment, but you can also always connect that to policy. You know, for example, you can do a story about plastic waste at the holidays, wrapping paper waste at the holidays. You know, that's kind of a common thing that you might see from environmental journalists this time of year. But you can also say, you know, what's the recycling policy at play here? You know, is there a role for the government, or is there something the government is doing to help fix this problem, rather than, as Disha and Alex said, putting all the onus on viewers as individuals? And it's both, right? There's a role for all kinds of stories in this space, especially for a general audience. And I think that's where we can really kind of give people stories that they get excited about and want to see, especially when you have platforms that reach all different kinds of audiences, right? Which ABC does. But then you also, like, my goal personally is if we can get a little bit of education, a little bit of explanation of something dense, or a little bit of that connection to policy or economics, then like that just makes it a more well-rounded story.
You segued perfectly, Stephanie, into my last question to you. But before I ask it, let me just remind everybody, we're now going to, after this last exchange with Stephanie, we're going to switch to Q&A. So please feel free to put questions in the chat. We already have some from RSVP, and I'll be getting ready to call on a couple of you who RSVP'd, so get yourselves ready, please. You can add more, everybody else, in the chat. Please do include your name and your outlet when you do so. So Stephanie, my last question to you, you're based in Washington, D.C., and arguably, pardon me, in Washington, the fate of Joe Biden's Build Back Better legislation is, I think, among the biggest climate stories in the world, because it's essentially going to shape how one of the world's leading climate superpowers approaches this challenge of trying to keep 1.5 degrees alive in the coming months and years. So how do you you and your ABC colleagues, how are you covering the drama there on Capitol Hill around the Build Back Better legislation so that your audience understands the climate implications of that?
So I personally, there's a whole team of my colleagues that cover Capitol Hill. I haven't been terribly involved in the day-to-day of that coverage, but I'm thinking a lot about what happens next. For example, this is a tremendous amount. I think the most that the federal government has ever committed to grants and different programs to fund local climate initiatives. So I'm thinking about ways to track that, and what's the way to help our audience understand what that money is actually going to, because especially with government spending in the US, the dollar amounts are always a big headline. But then for a broad audience, for a local audience who maybe they don't track the goings on of Congress, but maybe they want to know, all right, how much of that money is going to my state or my community, and what does that actually mean? All that information is out there and available, and it can be a slog to go through it all, but I think there's lots of stories that can be told about what that money actually does, and if it actually fulfills all of these promises, whether the programs that survive through that process, what that actually looks like, and if it actually hits the mark on what their goal is when they started out.
Okay, thanks. That's Stephanie Ebbs. She's the one of the climate producers and reporters at ABC News. And she has been joined by Disha Shetty, a freelance journalist from India, specializing in public health, and Alex Thomson, the chief correspondent at Channel 4 News in the UK. We're going to switch now to questions from all of you in the Talking Shop attendee list. And I'm going to start with, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, Ava Emerson. She's with Knowable. Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Eva. Thanks for taking my question. We're a more general science magazine, so we kind of cover, climate plus health plus, geology, all different kinds of things. I've heard a lot about, when we were trying to kind of keep a bit of track of what was going on with COP26, there's ideas for policies. You guys were talking about building back better. I'm just wondering if you have any advice on better tracking the success of and problems with emerging policies as they're coming out that are meant to battle climate change, in terms of really explaining whether these will have kind of the desired effects or not. I think one of the things, you kind of hear, okay, here's an idea, but will that actually get you to like the 1.5 degree climate change?
Thanks. Alex and Disha, maybe you guys could tackle this. Alex, I'm thinking about that hydrogen lorries story that you did. So how do you check and make sure that they aren't just blowing smoke at people who are popping off about this or that solution? And please be sure to unmute. There you go.
Yeah, I think it's slightly more dramatic than that. I'd start with some more good news. I'm ever optimistic. I mean, I really like the point Disha was making earlier about how, it's about people's kids. You've got our audience is basically two sectors. It's young people who don't have kids and older people who do have kids or grandkids. People care about their children. So that's one sector of the audience taken care of. And young people, we are told by every definable, measurable means that we've ever invented, also care. So we've got a huge open goal. Now, to get to Eva's point, look, particularly on television, which is a crude and superficial and rather childish medium at the best of times, we're going to get nowhere trying to say does a bit of policy here and there work. But let me tell you, I don't think my country is particularly weird. We've come through COP and we are now up against it. Our government is right up against the buffers. There is no room for maneuver or wiggle room. We've got critical, dramatic, picture-rich, information-rich stories. The Cambo oil field, which I mentioned, the insane plan to sink a coal mine, yes, a coal mine in the north of England, which is still rumbling on, which every single member of the entire British cabinet is terrified of even talking about, on or off camera. We're running out of time. These are the sort of stories around which you hang the policy, right? So go for the issue, go for the planning, go for the coal mine, go for the coal power station, go for the the motorway network or whatever it's going to be, because biodiversity, environment is all part of the same thing, and that's what you go to, and you hang the policy around that. Because all this is now post-COP, where we put in improved NDCs. Or most countries did, except for India's wasn't much better than the one before, and Brazil's was even worse. But most countries at least made some of it. Now they are pledging to do more. It's an ongoing process to the next COP. So, you've got the policy, you've got the promises, you've got the rhetoric, you've got the hot air, but it's around these actual stories, which these events, these happenings, that's where the journalism, the real rich feeding ground for journalism lies. And the second thing, just very briefly, keep giving people the tech story, the breakthroughs, the things which are going to get us through this. Keep giving them that. Mark began with an extraordinary one, this new research, which I hadn't heard on carbon. That means there is always hope. And the worst thing that journalists can possibly ever do is engender despair. And that in part is exactly what the kind of madder end of the fossil fuel industry wants. They want despair. They want, a part of them wants, there's nothing we can do about that. So that's what I'd say on that, Ava.
Thanks, Alex. Disha, did you want to, since you're our sort of science journalist expert on this panel, I think, at least as far as I can tell, I'm certainly not one.
Nor am I.
Do
you have anything you'd like to add to Eva's question?
So I'm a big fan of ground reporting. So sometimes, with a lot of these big policy announcements, it can make it look like these policies affect a lot of people. And then when you really go down to local communities, you realize their needs are very different, or some of these claims are very exaggerated. I would just say take any policy announcement with a pinch of salt, and then go to the ground and see how it's affecting people. Talk to farmers, housewives, just see how, for instance, at every COP now, renewable energy is sort of being projected as this solution, but it's not really. When I did some reporting in Western Ghats, which is a biodiversity hotspot in India, and small hydropower projects, for instance, there create as much destruction as they're projected as viable solutions. Solar power can displace indigenous communities because you need that land, and often it disproportionately affects vulnerable populations already on the fringes of society in certain countries. And so I would just say that no matter what policy you're covering, it's always a good idea to at least once or twice in a year to go to far-fetched communities and really look at, are these policies really working? And often the answer is it isn't. They aren't, and our solutions aren't really solutions sometimes.
And again, from some of our previous work at Covering Climate Now, as you cover solutions, remember that solutions are not just in the realm of technology, and they're not just even in the realm of policy. They can also be in the realm of activism. Certainly, Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future, that has been a solution. to climate change, if only because it forced the issue onto, let's be honest, it forced us in the media to finally break our climate silence and start talking about climate change in a highly visible way. Now, again, that's not a plea for us to be carrying water for activists. That's not our role. We are journalists. We should cover activists, however, as newsmakers, just like we cover politicians as newsmakers and CEOs, holding them to account, but also sharing their perspectives with our audiences as appropriate. So next question now, I'd like to go to, and again, I apologize in advance if I'm mispronouncing your name, Judith Murnett, I think. She's a freelance journalist. She's connected, as many of us are, with the Society for Environmental Journalists here in the United States. If you're not part of SCJ, check them out. Judith Murnett, can you go ahead with your question, please?
Sure, thanks for taking my question. I just wanted to push back a little bit on this idea that individual responsibility is the big lie. And I do understand that corporations have pushed this idea on us as a way of absolving themselves of responsibility. But I think maybe it's gone a little too far in that, you know, one thing is that giving people individual actions to take to combat the climate crisis is a hedge against frustration and despair. If I can say, oh, I put solar panels on my roof and that's an action that helps the climate, then I start to feel like I can move forward on the future and on combating climate. And I also think that, and I'm talking about mostly people in high consumption developed societies right now, like the one I live in, where if we're changing our individual behavior, we are public influencers. We're all influencers in a way, and the corporations change by public opinion and public pressure. And that comes from people understanding that they can do something and that something can be done. You know, when I put solar panels on my roof, my neighbors imitated me. Suddenly, you know, everybody's trading in their SUVs for Teslas in our neighborhood because it's like the thing to do. And I think that consumptive, you know, that behavior of consumers can put pressure on corporations. And I think people need to know that. So I'm just wondering what you all think the role is for individual responsibility. And Stephanie answered it a little bit in an interesting way, but what is the role that we can tell people, here's where your individual action might count? Thanks.
Thanks, Judith. Stephanie, could I ask you to start with that, and then Alex and Disha, if you want to add, please do.
Yeah, I mean, the point's well taken. I think that there is a history around this kind of narrative, but at the same time, you know, we try to present options for people in how they take this information. So I think personally, I've had a lot of discussions with colleagues, and I try to approach our coverage in, you know, for example, there's a connection to policy, there's a connection to who leads the country, right? So helping people become more informed on these issues more broadly and encouraging them, maybe not encouraging, maybe the wrong word, but helping them understand the connection between these issues and elections in their community. That is like, voting is a personal action. That is a personal role. We don't tell people how to vote. We don't tell people how to evaluate positions or policy, but helping them make the connection between these climate headlines that they may be seeing and the issues they care about and climate change. You know, there is both a systemic and personal component to all of these things.
Thanks, Stephanie. Disha or Alex, do you want to chime in, or should we go to the next?
Yeah, I mean, I'm broadly in agreement. I didn't want for a second to give the impression that we as individuals should take no action. But I'm more optimistic than that. I think we are all taking action because our whole entire culture is changing, and it's changing across the world. We get this stuff. We know this stuff. And a few years' time, you know, electric cars and whatever are going to become, you know, cheaper. There are other models available than Teslas. You know, that's all going to happen. But do not be under any illusion whatsoever that if we are going to keep to 1.5, then it is governments and it is the fossil fuel industry who are going to be needing to change. And the fossil fuel industry has not shown that it is susceptible to public opinion. It's lied, it's deceived, it's engaged in a raft of criminal activities globally to maintain its profits, just like big tobacco did before. It's no different. It's exactly the same problem, exactly the same issue. So on the one hand, in terms of its change, I'm optimistic because the world is changing. We're all changing with it, and that's great. And we're all making changes, and we're all getting consumer changes that we can increasingly afford, which is absolutely wonderful. But we know who the enemy is, and we know how they have got to be brought kicking and screaming and made to change. And it's governments which will make them change. You know, we spend $50 for every human being on the planet subsidizing oil and gas, right? You know, that is, as John Kerry said, an insanity, you know, and it is. That's where you're going to save the planet, you know, not by changing your own individual car.
Thanks, Alex. And you've given me just 1 second, Disha. You've given me an opportunity to mention to everyone, if you're not already following the year-long series Climate Crimes that Covering Climate Now is doing with the Guardian newspaper, please do. Climate Crimes is about the climate lies and other crimes that the oil and gas companies have been perpetuating for literally decades now, very much along the lines of big tobacco. Climate Crimes, check it out. It's on our website and also the Guardian website, trying to put back into the public narrative the fact that these companies have been lying about this. And to make it worse, as Alex just mentioned, we subsidize them nevertheless. Disha Shetty.
And Mark, if I may, buy Michael Mann's latest book on exactly that right now, and it's all there for you.
Yes.
And he savages rightly the Murdoch media empire, who've been complicit and fellow conspirators in this.
And that book is called, by Michael Mann, is called The New Climate War. All right, Disha, sorry to cut you off.
No problem. So 2 things I want to add. One is that individual responsibility will come into play when an individual's carbon footprint is extremely high. In much of the developing countries, that isn't true. And so it is a more global north conversation about how much more you can do. If your carbon footprint is already close to zero, there isn't much. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of the climate movement doesn't resonate with the young people in African and Asian countries, because our priorities are not the same and our consumption levels are not the same. Second is we tend to take for granted that democracy is present everywhere, and it isn't. It is again a global north thing, but also India is the world's largest democracy in terms of population. But again, in South Asia, that's not common, certainly not common in a lot of countries across the world. And so that limits how much individuals can do, I think.
Another example of what an excellent panelist we have today is that Disha has just foreshadowed one of our coming talking shops, which is going to be how do journalists hold power to account in countries that are not democracies. And it's no coincidence that some of the real laggard governments at COP26 and previously are not really full-fledged democracies. I'm thinking about Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, Brazil under Bolsonaro. How do journalists function to play our civic role of holding power to account? We're going to be getting to that in a future Talking Shop webinar in the year 2022. Before I go to the next question, Stephanie had a quick comment on this, and then I'm going to David Schechter at WFAA in Dallas.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, just quickly, one more thing I wanted to add on this is that I think, you know, for myself, which is at a general news organization, I try not to approach climate stories as if everyone has the same level of familiarity with the topic. And a perfect story, right, would have something for everyone, something for someone who is completely unfamiliar with climate change or climate science, renewable energy, all those things, and something new for someone who does. But I think one thing to keep in mind on this conversation on systemic versus personal roles is that we don't want to only make stories for an audience that is already educated and very knowledgeable and following these issues. We want stories that will expand that audience to hopefully everyone being interested and invested in these issues.
Bring them into the tent, folks. Okay, and now I'm going to turn to my friend and colleague, David Schechter. He's with WFAA in Dallas, Texas. And if you think ExxonMobil did not like Alex Thomson's story this summer about their lobbyist who talked a little incautiously, you should think about what the Texas governor said about David Schechter's coverage going into COP. David Schechter.
Thank you, Mark. And Alex, you got me thinking a lot about, you said that 100 companies are responsible for, I think, 3/4 of the CO2 emissions. So as a local reporter and also someone who covers, Dallas, but covers Texas and try to be regional about it, I know the history of misinformation and disinformation with oil and gas companies is pretty well documented and continues to be really well documented. The ads that they place and where they place them and all that stuff. I'm wondering if anyone on this panel, including Alex, if you can talk about how to report on getting the confidence. This is a question, it's a word I've used a lot, about having the confidence to take on an ExxonMobil or a Shell for their practices in a climate where the companies we may work for may not see them as being anything but just corporate citizens. So reporting on those industries and specifically on those corporations and making those into regional or local stories that you could actually tell.
Alex?
Goodness, well, the bigger the prize, the better the incentive, I would say, David. I'm just always amazed when people talk about Texas, because of course Texas is the place you go to see really big scale solar renewable energy as well. So there's an upside to all of this, as you'll know better than I. Look, I mean, I'm very lucky. I work for an organization which gives you, and I don't care whether you're a journalist or a dentist or an undertaker, whatever you do in the world, if you've got an employer who will give you the two most precious things, the two T's, time and trust, then you've got all you need in many ways. And I've been given a lot of time and a lot of trust down the years to pursue people and organizations, to nail down a story. I mean, I did one story which took 16 years, to kind of nail the people, but we did it, at the extreme end of things. I would like to hope that any editor, gets out of bed to kind of nail the big stories. And, in a way, the kind of, at regional and local level, there are amazing stories. I mean, in my country, they're barely covered now because regional and newspapers have been so eviscerated in the UK, and it's a tragedy. And it allows these people to get away with it. So, I just say, I'm sure you're like me. That's why you get out of bed in the morning, because there is no better feeling that when you finally do nail a story and get it out there, then you feel, rightly or wrong, you've made a little change in the world. That's why we do it.
I'd like to, unless Disha or Stephanie absolutely have a tearing need to comment there, I'd like to go to our next question. And this is from Kelsey Simpkins. She is a science writer at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Kelsey.
Thank you. So as Mark said, I'm a science writer at CU Boulder, and we're a big leader in climate environmental energy research. So it's great to be here today. We are actually hosting an event within weeks of COP27 wrapping up next year with United Nations Human Rights to highlight the human rights element of climate change. It's called the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit, and you can look that up online. And we, of course, are looking for coverage, but my question is really more around this element of the fact loss and damage were not successfully addressed at COP26. And this is a huge issue. And like you've said, anything that covers humans is a really great story, right? If we want to cover polar bears, cool. But if you want to cover the physics of climate change, great. But I feel like, there's this huge opportunity to really cover the human rights element and the human struggle in climate change. And I'm curious if you also see that as something that can help move the needle ahead of the next COP meeting.
So loss and damage and human rights, both key critical issues. I'm going to turn first to Disha.
So for me, this is not a peripheral issue. This is the issue. As a journalist covering climate change in the developing world, for me, it's extremely frustrating to report on communities when they ask me, and this has happened to me when I was reporting in Sundarbans, which is the world's largest mangrove forest, and it's an area that Sundarbans spreads across India and Bangladesh. And there are these islands that are going underwater. And while reporting there, one of the villager whose entire house is basically it's no longer there because the waves have torn it down. He asked me, "What can I do?" And the answer was nothing. He wasn't responsible for it. There was nothing he can do about it. And that's true of most communities. Most communities in Himalayan region, across the Bay of Bengal region, they've done nothing to contribute to this problem. And that's essentially, we're going back to the issue of historical emissions. And that's something that isn't covered a lot in the global north, because it does hold their own countries to account. And as Global South reporters, we do keep harping about it, but I don't think it really makes a lot of noise outside our own countries. And for us, and I was at COP on a CCMP fellowship, which brought journalists from 20 different developing countries to COP to cover it. Otherwise, I would not have been at COP. So the number of journalists and the mix of journalists covering COP itself is extremely wide, extremely global north, extremely developed country. So obviously the way it's covered, the way the results are covered, has a developed world lens to it. And so if you talk to any journalist from the developing world, they'll tell you human rights is the biggest issue for us. It's not something that sort of is at the bottom of our list. It's at the top of our list. And if it also sort of comes on the top of the list of journalists in the global north, that's going to make a difference to the larger conversation because of the disproportionate voice that they have.
Alex, did you want to speak up on that? And if not, I have a point to make, and then we're at the top of the hour.
Yeah, I mean, just the 2 points arising out of COP, the two key failures. Clearly the failure to pay for loss and damage, and clearly the failure on the richer part of the world to stump up the money that they should. Those are the two key failures, and that's absolutely where feet have got to be held to the fire in the coming year. Where Alex Sharma knows they were the key failures. He told me they were afterwards. It's obvious. So he's going to be there working towards that. We just hope that they retain their position, because obviously they're central to human rights. Of course they are.
Stephanie, did you want to add to this?
Well, I would say, this is something I've been thinking about quite a lot, because as a US based journalist, this was my first COP. I have not covered international policy extensively, obviously outside of the climate change space. And it is really striking how, in the US, obviously we're an American news organization. We're very focused on the politics and the conversation going on here. But, nothing happens in isolation, especially on this issue. So I think it is important to make those connections. And my goal is to create more opportunities to bring those questions to the policymakers, to ask, okay, ask someone like John Kerry, ask senators, ask the people who we hope to hold to account as journalists, is this a policy decision that you have made to let this happen? And if so, why is that considered the right path for the US, in your opinion? And what's going to happen next? Like in the US, you've seen a lot of stories about climate refugees and the possibility of this happening. If it is happening now, and if the next question is, what's going to be done to help those people? And I think there's a lot of questions that American journalists can start putting more to our government or our officials on, making sure that those concerns of other parts of the world are part of our kind of repertoire of questions and coverage.
And indeed, those concerns will have, I think, increased visibility at COP27, which is happening in December, next December, obviously, in Egypt. And it is an Africa-hosted COP, and sources of mine say that therefore there will be much more attention to the loss and damage issue. And if you're not quite clear on the difference between loss and damage and adaptation and mitigation, please go to the Covering Climate Now website. We explain all those differences in brief. Mitigation is about turning down the temperature. Adaptation is about dealing with and becoming resilient to the impacts that are here and bound to increase. And loss and damage is kind of what Disha is talking about there in the Sundarbans. I too have been privileged to do quite a bit of reporting in Bangladesh in that very region. We're talking about things that there is no adapting to. When your village has been destroyed, it is a loss, it is a damage. Those people who are dead are never coming back. That is loss and damage as opposed to adaptation. And that's why social justice and human rights and these other issues that we talk about are so intricately interwoven with all the topics that we've been discussing today. Before I thank our panelists, I'd like to remind all of you, if you could, stick around for 90 seconds afterwards, take a survey about the kinds of topics that you want Covering Climate Now to do in future talking shops. With that, I will, with very deep thanks in my heart, thank all three of our superb panelists today, Stephanie Ebbs of ABC News, Disha Shetty, an independent public health and science journalist from India, and Alex Thomson, the chief correspondent at Channel 4 News in the UK. I'm Mark Hertsgaard, and I'm with Covering Climate Now. We are so glad to have all of you. Please stick around, come to the site, bring your news outlet. We invite all comers, and we thank you very much and wish you a very pleasant day.